On the 7th of July, 1991, the mutilated bodies of 4 college girls were found in a college dorm room in Flagstaff, Arizona. Jackson Allred was taken into custody and charged with the killings of the 4 girls, including his girlfriend. What adds to the mystery is the account Jackson provided to investigators, claiming that a werewolf was responsible for the murders. Jackson was deemed mentally unstable and incapable of standing trial. He is currently housed in the Arizona State Mental Hospital for the duration of his life. Despite numerous interactions with various individuals over the years, he has consistently stuck to the same narrative without any alterations. This is the account of his experiences, documented by a journalist who conducted an interview with him in 2006. I beseeched for help in my mind as my body was being brutally attacked by an unknown entity, a sight I had never encountered or believed in until that dreadful night. I attempted to escape, but the creature was too powerful for me to even make a move. The realization that this might be the end flashed through my mind before I succumbed to the unbearable agony and lost consciousness. I was raised in an extremely devout household. My mother was so devout that she expelled me from our home at the age of 18 for being involved with a girl who did not belong to her church. Despite my father's objections, my resolute mother insisted on my departure. Filled with anger, I packed my belongings and departed, never to return. I didn't have much money saved up, being young, so I had to take the first job I could find in order to afford food. This was during a time when job hunting meant searching through the classifieds in a physical newspaper. I browsed through the job listings and came across a nighttime security position at Crescent Moon Lake near Sedona. The only issue was that it was quite a distance from where I was staying, having been kicked out by my mother and forced to live with my cousin, his wife, and their newborn baby. I called the company and scheduled an interview for the next day. I arrived at their office at noon and, after a brief 10-minute interview, I was offered the job. It didn't come as a surprise, as I was confident in my ability to get along with just about anyone, even those who are difficult. As I rode home on my motorcycle, I realized the person who did the interview failed to tell me the name of the person I was going to train with. Oh well, not a big deal, I thought. The next evening arrived and as I traveled along the deserted country road towards Crescent Moon Lake, I felt an eerie sensation and a shiver ran up my spine. I wondered to myself, what was that? I dismissed it as first-day jitters of starting a new job. As the security shack came into view, I saw the security guard who was going to train me standing in front of the shack smoking a cigarette. As I pulled up and turned off my motorcycle, he flicked his cigarette to the ground and said, "You must be Jackson. They said you'd be coming. I hope you brought a lot of coffee," he said with a grin. I could see he was middle-aged and his teeth were dark yellow due to years of smoking. "Yes sir, that's me. They didn't tell me your name though," I replied. "My name is Everett. Come inside. This is an easy job but there's a few things I have to show you before I take off for the day," he responded. I dismounted from my motorcycle and trailed behind him into the shack. Upon entering, the overpowering stench of cigarette smoke and sweat assaulted my senses. I nearly retched but managed to suppress the urge. The summer heat in this place must be unbearable, I thought to myself, picturing the discomfort of spending all day in the shack. Everett pivoted and informed me, "You'll mostly be stationed in this chair, but every 2 hours, you must walk the perimeter. Take a look at this portable clock, it has a keyhole on the back." He continued, "There are keys hanging from chains at various points along the perimeter. Insert the key, turn it, and it will mark the time on a piece of paper inside the clock, signifying that you've completed the round." Without a word, I nodded in understanding. Everett led the way out of the shack, and we embarked on a tour of the perimeter to locate the keys. After 30 minutes of instruction, we headed back to the shack. Suddenly, Everett turned to me and imparted advice that left me speechless. "I'll share a piece of wisdom I've given to every nighttime security guard, but they never seem to heed it, and they never return to work after." As we approached the shack, my mind was filled with various thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder if he was just messing with me, playing a prank on the new guy. Despite my usual ability to read people, I couldn't determine if he was joking or serious this time. "Well, I'll see you tomorrow," Everett said before lighting another cigarette and heading towards his car. I stood there, watching him leave, unsure of what to make of his words. Upon re-entering the shack, the foul smell assaulted my senses once more. I quickly opened the windows to let in some fresh air, unable to bear the stench. While I had enjoyed chewing tobacco in the past, cigarettes were never my thing. They always left me with a splitting headache. As I prepared to take a seat, I noticed that the only chair available was the one Everett had been using. It was made of vinyl, with his sweat stains clearly visible on the cushions. With a sigh, I realized that this was not the ideal way to start a new job. Placing my snacks and sandwich on the desk, I reluctantly settled into the sweat-soaked chair. I took a seat and immediately noticed the chair was surprisingly comfortable. It was a small positive in the midst of everything. I spent a long time lost in my thoughts, still feeling hurt and resentful about being kicked out of my own home for something as trivial as dating someone my mother didn't approve of. My girlfriend was just as kind and good as the people in my mother's church, which was full of judgmental hypocrites. I couldn't understand their way of thinking and my thoughts then turned to the warnings about going out during a full moon. When was the next full moon? I had never cared before, but now I was curious. I found a calendar on the wall that showed the moon cycle and saw that the next full moon was in 3 days. I sat back down, dozed off for a while, and then woke up, realizing it was almost time for me to walk the perimeter. The sun was still setting, which was good because it was only my second time doing this and I wanted to make sure I could find all the keys in the daylight. I got up, grabbed the clock, and left the shack to start my rounds. It took me less than half an hour this time to complete the perimeter walk since Everett wasn't around, and I walked faster than he did. As I entered the shack and turned on the light, I realized it was almost 9:30 p.m. My stomach rumbled, signaling it was time for a snack. Setting the alarm on my watch for 2 hours later, I made sure not to miss the next perimeter walk in case I dozed off. Working nights was new to me, and I wasn't sure if I could stay awake. Munching on potato chips, I wondered what my girlfriend was doing at that moment. Feeling her absence, I hoped she missed me too. Suddenly, I jolted awake to the alarm on my watch blaring. The bag of chips slipped from my hand and landed on the floor. This is going to be more challenging than I anticipated, I muttered to myself. It was only 11:30 p.m. and I had already drifted off. Rubbing my eyes, I got up, picked up the clock from the desk. I bent down and opened the desk drawer to search for a flashlight. There were multiple flashlights to choose from, and I opted for the large black metal one that police officers use. I considered that it could also be used as a weapon as I turned it on to check if it was functional. The flashlight worked well, emitting a bright light. The sky was clear, and the temperature was dropping outside. The refreshing cool night air felt pleasant as I began to patrol the area. My mind was occupied with thoughts of my girlfriend as I walked around, locking and checking each station. I easily found each key and thought to myself that this job would be a piece of cake. The only challenge would be staying awake. Everett was correct, I needed plenty of coffee. I made a mental note to buy some the next day before returning. Morning arrived, and it was a beautiful sight to see the sun rising over the mountaintops as I heard Everett's car approaching. I stood up, closed the windows in the shack, and tidied up before he arrived. As Everett got out of the car, I noticed he had a cigarette in his mouth and a large cup of coffee in his hand. "How's it going, boy?" he inquired. "Good, no issues, just as you said," I replied. He smiled, took a drag from his cigarette, and headed towards the shack. I gathered my belongings, stepped outside, and made way for him. "Well, that's good. This job is a breeze. I'll see you tonight. You better head home and get some rest," he said. "Good thing you have a motorcycle, that will surely keep you awake. See you later," he added as he shut the door to the shack. Without wasting any time, I hopped on my motorcycle and rode off. Feeling extremely tired, I was concerned about falling asleep during the 45-minute drive home. The next 2 days followed a similar routine, arriving at work, chatting briefly with Everett, and struggling to stay awake. Although I brought a large thermos of coffee each night, it helped, but I still found myself dozing off occasionally. It wasn't until the third night, the night of the full moon, that my life would change forever. Arriving at the shack on the night of the full moon, I had actually forgotten all about it until Everett mentioned it again. "Now remember what I said, boy. It's a full moon tonight, so stay in the shack the whole night. I'll show you in the morning how to manipulate the clock so it looks like you did your rounds." I asked him, trying to hide the fact that I was scared out of my mind. He started walking towards his car and didn't respond. Opening the door to his car and about to sit down, he looked back at me and said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Starting up his car, he lit up a cigarette, took a big drag from it, and drove off. Speechless, I stood there not knowing what to think or whether to believe him. What the hell could be so scary and dangerous out here? I thought. Going inside, I shut the door to the shack, put my snacks, lunch, and coffee on the table, then plopped down on the sweaty chair. My mind was spinning at this point. Part of me wanted to quit and leave immediately, while the other part was curious about what he meant exactly. Part of me still believed he was just pulling my chain. Sitting in that chair for a long time, I tried to come up with ideas of what he could possibly mean. I kept trying to figure out what a full moon would have to do with it. One thought did come to my mind as I said aloud to myself, "Nah, no way on God's green earth could that be." I wasn't certain how much time had passed while I was sitting there, but when I glanced at my watch, I saw that it was already past 9 p.m. and the darkness had fallen outside. It was already past the time when I should have done my perimeter walk. I considered getting up to do it, but I remained frozen in my seat. I thought to myself that if I got into trouble, I would have only myself to blame, as he had explicitly instructed me not to walk the perimeter. My stomach began to growl, and I felt myself getting drowsy. It was time for a snack and my first cup of coffee. Reaching into my lunchbox for some cheese and jerky, I suddenly heard scratching noises coming from outside the shack. I immediately sat up straight, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. It was completely silent as I sat there, my hand still inside the lunchbox, not moving a muscle, while my heart pounded in my chest, as if trying to escape. My mind raced as I tried to figure out my next move. I knew the shack door had a lock, but I had neglected to use it, and now I cursed myself for the oversight. I decided that the first thing to do was to lock the door as quickly as possible. Whispering to myself, I counted to 3 and then rushed over to the door to lock it. I jumped up from the chair and ran to the door, quickly flipping the deadbolt while keeping my shoulder against the door to prevent anything from coming inside. Once the door was locked, I slowly backed away, only looking behind me to find the chair again so I could sit down. I sat down, but this time I positioned the chair to face the door, rather than having it off to the side. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, for what felt like an eternity before my head began to nod from sleepiness. I realized I needed to eat and drink some coffee before I fell asleep. I was determined not to doze off tonight. I grabbed some cheese and jerky and poured myself a large cup of coffee. Midway through my coffee, as I was about to take another sip, I heard scratching sounds again. This time, it was louder and coming from the opposite side of the shack, right below one of the windows. I almost dropped my coffee cup as fear gripped me. I whispered to myself, wondering what was happening. Glancing at my watch, I hoped for morning to arrive soon. It was only midnight. I muttered, "It's only midnight." There was a phone in the shack for emergencies, and I debated whether this situation qualified. What if it was just an animal like a skunk or raccoon? They would either mock me or, at worst, I could lose my job, which I couldn't afford. I hesitated to pick up the phone, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it's just an animal seeking food or shelter, I reassured myself. Before I could finish my thought, I heard a terrifying growl, unlike any animal I had ever heard. It wasn't a raccoon, skunk, or any dog I knew. Trembling, I decided to call 911 when something crashed through the wall behind me. I attempted to turn around to see what it was, but all I could see was something dark that stood over 6 feet tall. It seized me by the shoulder, tearing into me, then dragged me out of the shack and into the darkness. I felt excruciating pain and the warmth of blood as it pulled me through the open field and into the forest. Once we reached the forest, it released its grip and walked a few feet away in front of me. It stood there looking at me. I could see it as clear as day as it stood upright in an opening big enough to allow the light of the full moon through. I lay there in horror as I could see before me what looked to be a werewolf. I was frozen in fear because it all seemed surreal, like a nightmare I was about to wake up from. I'm not sure how long it stood there looking at me before pouncing on me. I do remember it went for my neck first, ripping out a chunk of flesh and sending blood squirting out everywhere. I remember thinking, holy shit, I'm going to die now. I could feel each bite as it ripped and tore at different parts of my body. I vividly remember the smell of my blood as it escaped my body. One of the last thoughts that went through my mind before I blacked out was the thought of my girlfriend. The next thing I remember was waking up to the sun hitting my face as I lay there in the forest. It took me several minutes to sit in an upright position and clear my head. The first thing I noticed was I was covered in blood from head to toe. I began to search my body looking for bite marks or pieces of flesh missing where the werewolf had torn up my body, but I could find none. There was not a mark on me to be found, only some scars from my youth. What the hell? I said aloud. I sat there for several more minutes before trying to stand up. I tried to replay the events that took place. It seemed like one of those dreams you can vaguely remember after you wake up, but surely it had to happen because I was covered in blood and sitting in the middle of the forest. As I stood up, I looked all around to get my bearings. I struggled to walk, trying to get the blood circulating in my legs once more. My entire body felt rigid, as if I had run a marathon the day before, yet I also felt invigorated. It was as if I had received a massive surge of energy. As I made my way through the forest, I noticed that my senses were heightened far beyond their usual levels, which struck me as peculiar. My sense of smell was extraordinary, and my hearing was sharper than ever before. I could distinguish the sound of ants moving along the ground and the heartbeats of the animals in the forest. I could even estimate the exact number of birds and squirrels in the vicinity. Upon reaching a clearing, I spotted the white shack and noticed that Everett's car was absent, which was unusual since he should have been working that day. Approaching the shack, I observed the large hole that the werewolf had created when it burst through and seized me. Pausing for a moment, I contemplated my next move. The only option that came to mind was to return home. The idea of contacting the authorities crossed my mind, but who would believe my story? I lacked any evidence. The blood could have originated from anywhere, and for all they knew, I could have been responsible for the hole in the shack. Gathering my belongings from the shack, I mounted my motorcycle and set off for home. As I rode into town, the realization hit me that I needed to confide in someone about what had occurred. This was not a secret I could keep to myself. The first person who came to mind was my girlfriend. She was a college student who resided in a dormitory with 3 other girls, conveniently located on my route home. Although I was unsure of the time, it seemed early, perhaps around 6 in the morning. My watch had been torn off during the encounter, so I could not be certain. As I arrived at the dorm, I noticed a group of morning joggers passing by, giving me strange looks. I realized I was covered in blood and decided to clean up and change my clothes before going out again. Fortunately, I had a key to my girlfriend's dorm, so I didn't have to disturb anyone. As I made my way to my girlfriend's room, I saw that the door was slightly open, causing panic to surge within me. Knowing that my girlfriend and her roommates were always cautious about locking the door, I sensed that something was terribly wrong. Approaching the door cautiously, I was hit by the strong metallic scent of blood before even pushing it open. My heart raced as I slowly opened the door, revealing a gruesome scene. Blood was splattered everywhere, and the bodies of my girlfriend's roommates were mutilated and scattered across the living room floor. It was a horrifying sight, making it hard to distinguish one body from another due to the extent of the damage. In a state of shock, I rushed back to my girlfriend's room, only to find her lifeless body torn apart on the bed. I was on the verge of screaming in horror when a voice from inside the closet spoke to me. It was my mother, revealing the chilling truth that she was the werewolf responsible for the gruesome attack. She emphasized the importance of being with someone from our church, leaving me frozen in terror.